Hi guys, and welcome to today's video. One of the things that helps me in trying to understand blockchain gaming economies is taking a step back and try to look at each individual project as countries. And because they're countries, they have their own economy that makes the entire project function. So for today's video, we will be looking at how game devs can influence the economy using tools that governments have at their disposal in a similar way that these government entities would influence the regional economies. And in order to do that, we will first take a look at why game devs can be considered as government entities in these blockchain gaming economies. What are government economic policies? So we'll try to define that and paint a clear picture so everyone would understand. Then we will talk about what policies are available in these different countries that help policymakers influence the economy. And these are in the form of monetary and fiscal policies. Next, we will be talking about the GameFi equivalents of these policies. And lastly, of course, what the game developers can learn from these policies. So let's start. Regional economies are basically marketplaces where the transfer and creation of value happen. Blockchain gaming economies function in a similar way, but for the virtual economy. In these regional economies, there are government bodies that influence the economy through the different policies that they have. For blockchain gaming economies, the main government body would be the game developers, as they try to manage virtual economies and can implement similar policies that these government agencies would use. So with that in mind, what are government economic policies? So government economic policies are tools at the agency's disposal that they could use in order to influence the economy. An example of this is monetary policy, which is mainly used by the independent monetary agency, usually the central bank. So monetary policy determines the amount of money in circulation throughout the economy. So they could adjust the circulating supply by either adjusting the interest rates, increasing or decreasing bond issuance, or printing more money. It's considered an expansionary monetary policy if the agency decides to increase money supply for economic growth, or a contractionary monetary policy to decrease the money supply, usually targeting inflation stability. Another form of policy is called fiscal policy, which is mainly used by government agencies and entities to influence the economy. So you can think of fiscal policies as how the government would receive and spend its budget. So adjustments to government revenue and expenditure basically influence a lot of various factors, including inflation, employment, and money flow. It's considered an expansionary fiscal policy if the government spends more than what it taxes, usually done during periods of recession, to jumpstart the economy. And it's a contractionary fiscal policy if it's spending less than what it taxes, usually again to target inflation. Or a neutral fiscal policy, which seldom happens when the government spends exactly what it taxes. Keep in mind that policies should be complementary to the overall goal of the economy. So is the economy targeting inflation or promoting stable economic growth, which is usually the trade-offs when balancing the economy? So first off, let's zoom in to the different policies. First, take a look at monetary policy tools and its impact to the economy. The first way that monetary policy could influence the economy is through interest rate changes. So interest rates affect overall money supply by influencing the agent's investment behavior. So this means that higher interest rates means greater profits for these agents if they decide to put it inside the bank. This means that once money is transferred into banks, or once agents decide to save their money, there would be less cash circulating in the economy. Thus, it promotes a contractionary monetary policy. The other way around would be if short-term interest rates go down, meaning that it's going to be less profitable for agents to save their cash. Thus, they would rather spend it inside the economy and promote an expansionary monetary policy. Another way that monetary agencies or the central bank can influence money supply is through bond issuance. Similarly to interest rates, bonds are also considered investment vehicles that are more stable in nature, meaning that it attracts a certain market of investors meaning that the more bonds the central bank would issue means that more cash is being held by that monetary agency, which in turn leads to less supply of money circulating in the economy. Inversely, if more money is needed to circulate, then the central bank can just buy back the bonds to introduce more cash inside the economy again. And lastly, of course, a unique characteristic of the central bank is that it could print money. And it is a unique power that is held by the monetary agency. And this, of course, directly affects monetary supply by introducing new bills in circulation. So why would central banks want to influence the money supply inside an economy? Remember that there is a certain value associated to each economy. Usually it's tied up to the gold reserves of particular regional economy. But imagine that the more cash that's being circulated inside the economy, given that the value of that economy is the same, means that each piece of cash, let's say each dollar bill, would be worth less due to the inflationary mechanisms involved inside the economy. So it's a balancing tool. So these monetary policies are balancing tools by the central bank in order to keep inflation rate at a certain stable level so that the economy still grows, but then inflation doesn't occur inside the economy or occurs at a minimal rate inside the economy. Next, let's take a look at fiscal policy tools and its impact. So fiscal policies, again, is mainly how the government receives and spends its budget. The first way that the government receives its budget, it's through taxes. So taxes are the main revenue source of the government, and these are implemented on activities that either have an inelastic demand or activities that the government wants to reduce or discourage. So for example, it could be a tax on cigarette products because cigarettes are bad for your health, and the government would use this money in order to create program that would help people that suffer from lung conditions because of cigarette smoking. But at the same time, taxing the tobacco industry would lead to higher prices of cigarettes, meaning that people would actually spend less on cigarettes now that they have a higher price, or they would actually buy less of that particular product now that it's more expensive. So tax policies actually impact the economy because it constrains public consumption. So instead of economic agents using the money to consume goods and services, it reroutes the funds and the government would then spend it on how it deems fit. The next aspect, of course, is government expenditure. Government expenditure is basically how the government spends its budget. It stimulates economic growth if development is the main target of its spending. And development can be in the form of infrastructure like roads and ports. It helps stimulate jobs because of the construction of these particular areas of development. And these jobs, of course, stimulate the economy because it's the transfer of income towards a different sector where those who receive that income would have the ability to consume goods and services inside the economy. But government expenditure is affected by various factors, including politics, trade openness, and business cycles. So keep that in mind. Another form of fiscal policy in terms of government, I wouldn't say revenue, but then how the government would increase its budget, so government capital, is in the form of debt. So debt is another form of government financing that adds to the entity's budget for expenditure. Too much debt might cause government expenditure to focus on repayment rather than development, or might pass the burden on to the taxpayer, which is not really good in stimulating the economy. It's not an ideal way to stimulate the economy due to the use of government expenditure. And of course, debt is prone to politics because you're loaning money from a different entity, and that entity might have their own agenda and it might influence the behavior of the government entity. So now that we've learned what fiscal and monetary policies are, let's take a look at how these would look like in blockchain gaming economies. So for monetary policy, basically interest rates that impact money supply, which thus impacts GDP, could be treated as the developers adjusting the rewards for regular token staking. So you can look at token staking as a way as an investment vehicle or as a savings account for different market players. And the gaming developers or the game devs could actually adjust the rewards in order to influence how much tokens are being staked inside this protocol. Next is the issuance of bonds in order to influence money supply. This, on the other hand, is still token staking, but then it's not your regular token staking. It's more of that time-locked token staking where the tokens are bound for a specific period of time, similar to that of bonds. Of course, this could be adjusted depending on the need of the game devs at a certain time. Next is the introduction or printing of new money inside the economy. This is mainly done through token minting inside the gaming economy through game participation. So the difference with these policies to that of the monetary policies in regional economies is that game devs have the ability to create demand for an item or create special in-demand items out of thin air because they're basically creating virtual in-game assets out of nothing, which is not, of course, not a characteristic or not possible in real life. And this basically would impact the rewards or how players would deem the rewards to be valuable depending on how limited or how hard these rewards or in-game items would be to acquire. This is interesting because for most gaming protocols, their governance token is capped at a certain level. So once all of that is introduced in circulation, the team will have a hard time influencing or adjusting rewards in these staking protocols by adding more tokens in. Thus, the creation of in-game items would be handy because it could be considered a substitute to that of adding more tokens inside the rewards of the staking protocol. But keep in mind as well that these monetary policies has a trade-off. So the trade-off is basically balancing between inflation stability and economic growth stability as well. Next, for fiscal policies. So fiscal policies in the blockchain gaming economy come in the form of your tax policies, being the transaction fees, breeding fees, and withdrawal taxes inside these gaming protocols. Government debt could be seen as your token pre-sales, your private sales, your seed rounds, where eventually those who participate in these rounds the game devs would have to pay them back in the form of tokens, which will be unlocked or throughout the lifetime of the gaming project. Lastly, government expenditure in terms of blockchain and gaming economies could be considered as their software infrastructure investments, their server infrastructure developments, your blockchain infrastructure developments, your anti-cheating protocols, the building of different decentralized finance capabilities inside your ecosystem. These could be considered government expenditure for the blockchain gaming economies. So some things to keep in mind as well is that these tools are affected by trade openness or how open the economy is to foreign trade, basically. And foreign trade in blockchain gaming economies is basically how easy it is to enter and exit the economy. It's also influenced by the debt levels of the economy. Business cycles in this sense would be the overall crypto market, the fluctuations of the overall crypto market, and of course, exchange rates or how much the tokens inside the economy would be valued to fiat. Research has been done as well that these fiscal policies will only be effective if its fiscal multiplier is greater than 1, meaning that one additional dollar of fiscal stimuli causes the growth of real GDP by greater than $1. So what can developers learn from all of this? First, developers should keep in mind that basic policy implementation should be aligned and consistent to overall economic goals. An example of this, if the goal of the economy is to have mass adoption or hyper growth, meaning more players would enter the economy, then its assets should be cheaper relative to other games as well in order to attract new players or more players to enter in the market. And the government policies or the monetary and fiscal policies of the blockchain gaming economy should align with this particular economic goal. Next, developers should understand the trade-offs between inflation and growth stability. So regional economies usually set and stick to inflation targets so that it doesn't stagnate economic growth. So developers should understand that there is a trade-off between inflation and growth stability. What regional economies usually do is they set inflation targets and keeping inflation within a certain range in order to promote economic growth, but at the same time, not really have a high level of inflation inside the economy. Next, in terms of game creation, developers should keep in mind that they should make mechanisms or create mechanisms within the game to allow for policies similar to the ones mentioned previously to impact their economy, especially when economic shocks occur. Next point, game devs should have created mechanisms inside the game to allow them or to allow these policies to impact the economy. This is especially useful when economic shocks occurs inside these gaming economies, which are unforeseen by the game devs. Having these levers in place would help mitigate the effects of these shocks and allows the developers to somewhat influence the economy and basically pull levers within their economy to mitigate the effect of the shocks. Of course, similar to governments, you cannot please all stakeholders. So with this in mind, game devs should really zone in on what really matters in order to have a healthy economy and stick to that. Changing of policies would hinder economic growth because there's no continuity in how these are implemented, and it would just hinder the progress of the current policies that have already been set. Thus, that's why it's important to have policy alignment to a specific economic goal so that developers would not keep on changing their economic policies.